Chapter 7, Institutionalism. Institutionalism was once one of the dominant paradigms in the United States. It boasted several presidents of the American Economic Association, and its members participated as equals in an active and lively scholarly exchange with neoclassical economists. Early institutionalist economist John R. Commons and his followers were pioneers in practical applications of economic theory. They undertook extensive empirical work on the business cycle and played a major role in the establishment of the National Bureau of Economic Research, an organization that remains one of the most important think tanks in the world and is the official authority for dating of expansions and recessions in the United States. Another early institutionalist, Thorstein Veblen, wrote complex critical analyses of American economic behavior, and some of the terms he coined, conspicuous consumption for example, became a part of our everyday language. And yet, despite all of this, today there is possibly no other school of thought that seems more foreign to the average economist than institutionalism. Take, for example, this passage from a classic work by Paul Dale Bush. The institutional structure of any society incorporates two systems of value, the ceremonial and the instrumental, each of which has its own logic and method of validation. While these two value systems are inherently incompatible, they are intertwined within the institutional structure through a complex set of relationships. This appears to have absolutely nothing in common with the discussion of investment, unemployment, marginal cost, equilibrium, entrepreneurs, and so on that one finds in other schools of thought in this book. Indeed, most economists would say that it fails one of the discipline's key primary standards, subject matter. It is not, they would contend, economics at all, but sociology. To institutionalists, however, not only is this economics, but it is on a much deeper and far more significant level than that approached by other schools of thought. One cannot possibly understand modern capitalism, they contend, without laying bare the value structure that legitimizes it. It is the latter that truly drives economic activity, not fiscal policy, the tax structure, or capital expenditures. Those are mere details. The path to understanding their perspective must start with the concept that Homo sapiens are social animals. Nothing else is more fundamental to their view. We live, eat, reproduce, grow, and die in packs. This is as instinctive to us as it is to wolves, chimpanzees, ants, or bees. No individual animal in any of those species consciously chooses to live with the others. It is hardwired into them because it evolved as a survival mechanism. Institutionalists further argue that none of the evidence of our prehistory indicates that we once lived by ourselves and then decided, via social contract, to surrender some of our freedoms to live together. Humans have always been social because it is as natural to us as bipedal locomotion or live birth. This has to institutionalists immense consequences, not the least of which is that the basic building block of a study of economic behavior must be culture, not the individual. This emphasis on evolution and culture represented and continues to represent a fundamental departure from the equilibrium analysis and methodological individualism that dominates the mainstream. Part of the reason for the shift was that these were brand new and exciting concepts in Veblen's day. Just as Adam Smith, born a few years before Isaac Newton's death, was so influenced by the latter's ideas that he adopted the natural law metaphor for our science, so Veblen did the same with Charles Darwin and the work of the first modern anthropologists. But there was more to the transformation than simply the novelty of these new approaches. The United States in the late 19th century was a, quote, world of growing industrialization and rapid socioeconomic change, giving budding institutionalists ample subject matter for their new approach. The quote was from Anne Mayhew. They believed that it showed very clearly that economic structures and behavior changed over time, just as species do, and that the operative mechanism was culture. That all economists were not similarly inspired was, say institutionalists, because they had already accepted the Newtonian view so completely that they could not see beyond it, as with neoclassicals, or they already had their own theory of capitalist transformation, as with the Marxists. But for institutionalists, the combination of Darwin's evolutionary theories, the discovery of the concept of culture, and the transformation of American capitalism pointed to a new way of understanding economies. It began with the idea that all behavior is continually evaluated as being either appropriate or inappropriate. Those acts falling into the former win approval and status for the individual, things every bit as important to Homo sapiens as food, shelter, and clothing. The alternative can lead to formal and informal sanctions, ranging from not being invited to a party to imprisonment or execution. For the most part, however, such penalties are not necessary, as we each instinctively strive to voluntarily meet the standards of our reference group. Sometimes our conformity occurs on a conscious, or perhaps more appropriately self-conscious level. For example, when we are trying to gain membership into an exclusive club, or when you're the new kid at school. But it is, generally speaking, subconscious and automatic because cultural conformity is in our nature. It is what makes us human and how we identify with our tribe, and we need a tribe to survive. This is not to say that there are not times when people rebel against the norms. Instances with any significance, however, involve those people acting together. Those who opposed segregation in the American South, for example, represented an entire subculture, not just a few individuals, with competing ideas of right and wrong. What each side in this deeply divisive debate viewed as appropriate behavior was mutually exclusive. Each group tried its best to bring to bear formal and informal sanctions, including acts of terror and violence, which would force the opposition to submit to their ideals and thereby change, or in the case of the segregationists, maintain the general value structure of the society. And note that in the end, while the desegregationists were victorious, this did not mean that the segregationists simply accepted it. For the overwhelming majority of that group, their minds had not been changed, and they did whatever they could to continue to encourage the behavior of which they approved. However, the scales had been tipped, and as new generations of Southerners grew up, attitudes adjusted. Not completely, but substantially. This is consistent with the institutionalist belief that true cultural change takes a very long time because the values are so deeply seated during the process of acquiring them. Incidentally, segregationists and desegregationists, having had many common social experiences, inevitably shared values too. Note the importance of power in the above. Institutionalists believe that this must be taken into account in our economic analyses. Wages, for example, are decisively affected by it. While one's productivity is certainly a factor, it is not, as argued in some other schools of thought, the only one. Women, blacks, and other such groups, institutionalists say, would attest to this. Institutionalists also argue that it is much easier to recognize historical rather than contemporary injustices because we find it extremely difficult to critique what is a function of the values we take for granted. This also points out the embeddedness of the economy with respect to the rest of society. It is not separate or distinct, but a function of, intimately connected to, and consistent with the larger culture. Markets reflect and reward the values of market participants. For example, if in the 1950s a non-racist entrepreneur in the American South had decided to hire a black woman to sell jewelry at his shop, he would very likely experience at the very least a fall in sales, if not outright violence. If the entrepreneur wishes to stay in business, then he is forced to replace her with a white employee, regardless of the black woman's qualifications and regardless of his social views. Where the culture is racist, the market is racist, because the market is simply one of the means by which the culture expresses its values. This has the effect of reinforcing them, for even the non-racist entrepreneur must take them into account if he is to stay in business. Note that this view is in stark contrast to the arguments from schools of thought that say that the market destroys racism, since it is supposedly encouraging colorblind employment policies guided solely by the qualifications of the applicant. This, according to the institutionalists, is more than naive. It represents a fundamental misunderstanding of economic behavior. Is this economics or sociology? To the institutionalists, it's difficult to imagine anything more important to the economic well-being of Americans in the South throughout this period than racism. It was a prime determinant of wages, income, employment prices, migration, industry, education, and so on. It shaped the entire landscape and entered into every part of people's lives. How can this, they ask, not be economics? Next section, the institutionalist approach. Note that such an analysis requires a very different skill set than most economists learn. The institutionalists must delve deeply into history, structure, power relationships, politics, and so on of any society to begin to get a sense of the values that drive the economy. Simply taking account of GDP, interest rates, wages, and so on is not sufficient. Many non-institutionalist economists view this as an atheoretical exercise in which the researcher is simply describing, without a larger theoretical framework, something that they see as prone to unconstrained speculation and bias. This is decidedly untrue, say institutionalists, and a function of the fact that outsiders simply do not recognize the method that is being applied. There is, in fact, a carefully considered and long-established general theory of the economy. The key organizing concept is the idea that all values inevitably fall into one of two categories. They are either ceremonial or they are instrumental. And while it is a gross oversimplification to say that the former is bad and the latter good, it's a decent place to start. Economies dominated by ceremony stagnate, oppress, and exploit, and those driven by instrumentality develop, nurture, and enable. Yet adherence to ceremony is an integral part of being human. Ceremonial values are past binding and oriented toward defining status and acceptable behavior in society. Behaviors sanctioned by ceremony derive their legitimacy not from logic or experimentation, but from authority. These values are so deeply ingrained in us that it is difficult to recognize them. Indeed, we may vigorously argue that we are choosing to act this way because it is eminently logical to do so. But this is not really true. Why, in the United States, do women take their husband's last name in marriage? Do men wear strips of brightly colored cloth tied around their necks for formal occasions? People maintain eye contact as a sign of honesty, and so on. None of these is universal among humans, and it would not have been possible to logically predict them in any scientific way. Alternative behaviors could have just as easily evolved and did so in other cultures. But we would find theirs terribly uncomfortable, even ridiculous, the very definition of foreign. Ceremonial behaviors are thus culturally relative. They make sense only in the societies where they are practiced. They derive their legitimacy from their connection to tradition. You would think that as a consequence we would take ceremonial values with a grain of salt and exhibit considerable tolerance for deviations, but usually the opposite is true. This is because these ritualistic behaviors represent a vitally important sense of our belonging to the tribe. Challenging these behaviors can be very upsetting to us, and thus conspicuous adherence is the rule rather than the exception. Take fashion, for example. Because these standards change within our lifetime, we can clearly see that these are not based on some set of timeless criteria. It is obvious that they have no particular rational basis other than to wear warmer clothing when it's cold and cooler when it is hot. And yet, Lord forbid you violate these subjective rules. I once owned a lime green leisure suit with which I wore a brightly colored floral shirt and platform shoes. Needless to say, it is not part of my current wardrobe. In fact, I find it difficult to even look at pictures of me from the 70s, and my daughters were very shocked to see photographs of their dad with hair down to his shoulders. But it's not just me. There would most definitely be social and professional consequences if I suddenly decided to dress as I did back in high school. People would frankly avoid me for my decision to flout a rule of behavior for which there is no rational basis whatsoever, and which had been perfectly acceptable in an earlier decade. I might be the very same person, but I would lose status and power, and that's what ceremony is all about. By contrast, instrumentally warranted behavior is goal-oriented and experimental. Correctness is a function of one's success in achieving the end in question. Such actions are not culturally relative and may be deduced without knowledge of social norms, although information about available technology is necessary. For example, say the goal is dental health. What is the best way to keep your teeth from falling out? Brushing them to remove food and bacteria is a useful method whether you are in modern-day Costa Rica or ancient Rome. Note that this is goal-oriented in the sense that it is not the act of brushing per se that's important to you. As such, you will be willing to try different methods. If science develops a new and easier method of maintaining dental hygiene, you would be happy to stop brushing and adopt this new technique. This is typical of instrumentally sanctioned behaviors. Theirs is the logic of trial and error, and they are driven by science and technology, not fashion. Even though I do not wear my lime green leisure suit anymore, I still brush my teeth, albeit with a more technologically advanced toothbrush. The basic aim of institutionalist research is to determine by which value set an economy is primarily driven. Are behaviors dominated by ceremony, such that people generally engage in acts that related to status and the creation of invidious distinctions, the subjective determination that one group is superior to another, racism and sexism, for example? Or is goal-oriented problem-solving more common? Here is the true key to the economy, for the former impedes progress while the latter encourages it. The typical approach in such analyses involves pattern modeling and storytelling. This requires studying history and culture to develop internally consistent explanations of the behavioral patterns. Note that individual motivations like utility or profit maximization are not the object. It would be helpful to know these, but realistically speaking, how likely is it that we'll discover these? Furthermore, the rules of behavior are far more revealing. Take, for example, the situation of walking in on a group of people playing cards. In trying to follow their actions, which is more useful? Knowing why they are playing, to win, for camaraderie, to get out of the house? Or which game it is? Both would be wonderful, but if you can only have one, it's an easy choice. This is how institutionalists view their research. They are trying to figure out what game is being played, what is the object, and what are the rules. Note that under this approach, market economies are simply one particular set of rules. Institutionalist economic analysis is much broader. Institutionalist economists recognize that there are some obvious problems associated with this method of analysis. To begin, can one not argue that some ceremonial behaviors are indeed oriented toward solving a, quote, problem, unquote? It is certainly true that racist Southerners believed that they had an issue that required resolution. How useful is this analysis if it can be used to argue that the systematic and violent oppression of Americans with darker skin is instrumental? To avoid this, institutionalists are rather specific regarding what qualifies. Instrumentality is necessarily limited to what they call democratic problem solving or the extension and enhancement of the life process for the community. Genocide, oppression, discrimination, and so on are thereby expressly excluded. Instrumentality is about raising the standard of living of the average citizen. The goal of ceremony, meanwhile, is the arbitrary award and maintenance of status, power, and privilege. This still does not give us an unambiguously set of defined analytical concepts and rules that we may apply to an economy to quickly determine whether it's driven by ceremony or instrumentality, but institutionalists are aware of this. It is hard and contentious work sifting through the value structure of a culture, and they make no apology for this. At least such arguments, they say, are focused on the real issues and not on relative trivialities like fiscal policy or tariff rates. At some level, the latter are certainly of interest, but they do not hold the key to growth and prosperity, particularly when they, too, are actually driven by the social system. The ceremonial-instrumental dichotomy does. Incidentally, one highly formal method that has been embraced by institutionalists is system dynamics analysis. It is essentially a form of computer simulation of social systems created by MIT engineering professor Jay Forrester, but it is far more than just a programming approach. Forrester and his followers have forwarded a number of theories regarding the operation of economies, natural environments, business enterprises, and so on, each of which has tended to be very consistent with the institutionalist analysis. While its use is not widespread, there is a strong sense that it may represent a useful means of organizing studies based on the importance of the ceremonial-instrumental dichotomy. Application. Because it can be very difficult to imagine these concepts in operation, especially for the traditionally trained economist, an example may be useful. Perhaps the easiest research to understand is that dealing with developing economies. For example, institutionalist Dilmus James asked the question, why, despite the fact that Latin American countries unquestionably devoted more resources to technology since the 1970s, had they not achieved any marked progress in terms of development? Should they not, according to the orthodox economic perspective, have found an increasing ratio of capital to labor, resulting in a higher rate of growth and standards of living? And yet they had not at the time of James's publication, which was 1996. To James, the answer is a function of inadequate institutions. Breaking down the specifics of the value and incentive structures in these nations reveals that, despite a superficial shift towards problem solving and the logic of technology, their societies are instead dominated by status, invidious distinction, and conspicuous consumption. A great deal of this can be traced to the extremely unequal distributions of income and wealth that exist, the deeper reasons for which will be addressed in a moment. As a consequence, power is concentrated in the hands of a very few. Little surprise, then, that extension and enhancement of the life process for the community is not the dominant activity. Instead, the social elites employ the available resources to solidify their position and demonstrate to others how successful they are. Thus, Latin American universities may purchase cutting-edge scientific equipment for which they do not really have a use when the average citizen's needs are more basic and desperate. The acquisition had nothing to do with the community in general. It was an act of conspicuous consumption on the parts of those in power. It was meant to impress and intimidate others by imitating the consumption patterns of universities in more wealthy nations. This is also why there is more money in being an administrator than a scientist, that projects have only sufficient funding for the purchase of technical equipment and very little for operation, and that multiple institutions may purchase the same unnecessary equipment. This is not about solving problems. It is about status. It is ceremonial. No amount of World Bank aid, debt forgiveness, or privatization will change this. This begs the question of whence the tremendous inequities arose in the first place. While a good institutionalist study would avoid generalizing across all of Latin America, the quick and easy answer here is ethnic. Those who own are typically of Spanish and Portuguese descent. Those who do not are Mayan, Aztec, Incan, and so on, the indigenous populations of those modern nations. From the beginning of European colonization, there was a concerted and deliberate attempt to dominate those who inhabited these regions, behavior driven by ceremonial values. This, according to institutionalists, is the real explanation. Focusing on financial flows, fiscal policy, government budgets, privatization, investment, or savings rates will never shed any real light on what has kept Latin America from development. Rather, they detract our attention from the real issues and offer false precision and spurious correlations in the place of true enlightenment. Once the general orientation of economic activity is shifted towards instrumentality, then we can focus on what interest rates should be. Method. As suggested above, institutionalists place a great deal of emphasis on description. This is because they do not assume, as in some other schools of thought, that economic behavior is standard across cultures and time. To them, it is no more instinctive than religion, politics, or kinship patterns. This is not to say that there may not be commonalities, but these are to be discovered and not assumed. Thus, an important step in any institutionalist study is the examination of the social and historical roots of the phenomena in question. From these, they derive the rules of the game, or the rules of behavior in that society, which they then study to see which they would categorize as ceremonial and which as instrumental. Institutionalists believe that, as argued in the card game example, learning the rules of the game is not only more important than knowing the agent's motivations, it's also a more reasonable goal. Reasons for playing may vary widely, but regardless of why they are at the table, in poker, 3 of a kind beats a pair, period. Transferring the analogy to capitalism, a business owner need not be concerned with profit as their personal goal, as assumed in neoclassicism. It could be they just enjoy interacting with their customers. But under capitalism, profit is a rule. If your enterprise does not generate greater revenue than expenditures, it must shut down. Hence, everyone is forced, regardless of their personal feelings, to earn a profit because of the manner in which our system is organized. In addition, institutionalist research sees the economy as simply part of the larger social system. It must be consistent with other social rules and beliefs for them to exist together, and the economy will reflect the larger set of values. That said, economies and cultures evolve. This evolution is path-dependent in the sense that past events and human actions create the future. But there is no assumption, as under Marxism, that we will witness some specific unalterable pattern or that we can expect progression and not regression. This is yet another reason that institutionalists place heavy emphasis on description. Knowing how the U.S. economy worked in 1800 does not guarantee that we know how it worked in 2000. Note that while institutionalists are not flatly against building mathematical models, they insist that these must be a means rather than an end. That said, the range of variables assumed to be relevant in the typical institutionalist study is such that it's often extremely difficult to formalize in the manner necessary to express economic behaviors in equation form. System dynamics has garnered some attention because of its underlying philosophy being similar to that of institutionalism, in that it assumes that social systems are holistic and evolutionary and marked by path-dependent change. It is very flexible, but also very complex and requires specialized software. Thus, while it's been used in some limited applications, it has not become widespread. Views of human nature and justice. One of the key premises of institutionalism is that humans are first and foremost social animals. They naturally live in groups in the same manner as lions, hyenas, and chimpanzees. A major part of their identification with a larger group is some set of shared beliefs, which, even if they may seem ludicrous and arbitrary to others, are viewed as sacrosanct to those within the tribe. This is not to say that there are not pragmatic and utilitarian values, but many are not. Furthermore, Homo sapiens want to be considered upstanding members of their social group and thus seek status, sometimes at the expense of others. The latter particularly concerns institutionalists, and one of their primary concerns with respect to justice is the existence of exploitative behavior in society. An economy is fair when it is oriented toward devising pragmatic solutions to the physical and emotional needs of those within the community, not enforcing arbitrary codes of behavior that enrich some by impoverishing others. Standards of behavior. Primary. As has been emphasized above, the social nature of human economic behavior is absolutely central to the institutionalist analysis. Someone arguing otherwise is not an institutionalist. Likewise, the beliefs that economies are embedded within the rest of society and that they evolve are core. Meanwhile, one will not find any institutionalist analysis that assumes that the economy automatically tends towards full employment, that agents are completely rational or in possession of full information, or that capitalism is natural. Markets are just one of many tools we can use to achieve instrumental ends. Secondary. One may, however, find institutionalists who enjoy employing mathematical models and those who reject them. In addition, there are those who think that institutionalists should openly judge the value structures of societies, and others who believe that the fact that we are just as much a product of our own prejudices as those we are studying makes this tricky at best. Although much of the research on contemporary economies focuses on flaws in the capitalist system, one is nevertheless free in institutionalism to argue that the market does things well. It is a tool, and as such, its correctness is a function of the problem at hand. Something that is noteworthy in institutionalism is the widespread acceptance of what is, to a large extent, a different school of thought, post-Keynesianism. Despite the fact that Keynes's work arose independently of their own, many institutionalists immediately embraced it, and in a form that was much more consistent with his original intent. This is not altogether surprising, given Keynes's self-conscious struggle to get his reader to escape from habitual modes of thought and expression. This was unnecessary when it came to the institutionalists. They had already rejected many of the tenets of neoclassicism that, in the opinion of Keynes and the institutionalists, created the difficulty mainstream economists had in explaining the Great Depression. The modern-day result of this is the fact that the main institutionalist journal, the Journal of Economic Issues, welcomes submissions coming from a post-Keynesian perspective, and many institutionalists also describe themselves as post-Keynesians. Indeed, at one point, the flagship journals of both schools of thought were at the same institution, the University of Tennessee, your author's alma mater. Popular themes in institutionalist research include economic crisis, the role of culture in economies, and gender issues. That said, the nature of this school of thought is such that a wide variety of topics, from sustainability to pedagogy, is addressed. Contemporary activities. There are two main institutionalist associations, the Association for Institutional Thought and the Association for Evolutionary Economics. Both meet annually, the former as part of the Western Social Sciences Association, and the latter in conjunction with the American Economic Association. Because the Association for Institutional Thought is a large part of the Western Social Science Association, they tend to have much more control over their conference. On the other hand, the Association for Evolutionary Economics has found its participation in the American Economic Association to be increasingly constrained over the years, including reductions in the number of sessions they are permitted to host. But the Association for Evolutionary Economics is important both because their meetings take place within the much larger annual ones where the primary job market is hosted, and they sponsor the main institutionalist journal, the Journal of Economic Issues. Criticisms. The most common attack on institutionalism is that it is all description and no theory or modeling. How can it truly be a scholarly analysis if you are not identifying generalities and specifying relationships among various phenomena? While it is quite true that Mars is different from Saturn, which is different from Earth, for example, we cannot expect to understand planets if we leave it there. Our job as scientists is to dig deeper and find out what they have in common and what makes them unique. One institutionalist practice is uncontrolled speculation where anything goes, and laundry lists of individual characteristics substitute for laws of behavior derived from careful deduction. The other main criticism is that even if what institutionalists do is sound research, it's not economics. The study of social relations, power, and cultural mores may well be fascinating and useful, but it is the purview of sociology, anthropology, or history. Economists study prices, markets, and marginal decision-making. Then the final rejoinder. Institutionalists contend, first, that they are developing models and theories. It is just that those trained in other approaches are unfamiliar with their methods. And they do, in fact, believe that very important generalities exist across economies. But these exist with respect to ceremonial and instrumental valuing, the embeddedness of economies within larger social systems, and the centrality of culture and evolution in human behavior. These are the key issues in all economic research. Institutionalists believe that what neoclassicals see as the common factors are really just flawed observations of their own culture that they then project onto others. This bias is not intentional, but institutionalists say a result of exactly what they've been arguing all along. Humans think of the behavior of their own tribe as right and natural. This is a tendency for any researcher, whether they be neoclassical, institutionalist, Marxist, or whatever. The problem is that neoclassicals are completely unaware that they are committing such an error, while institutionalists, though not immune, stand guard against it. With respect to their research not being economics, institutionalists argue that to the contrary, they are actually focusing on the issues that truly matter. Whether the money supply should rise by 3 or 5% obviously has some significance at a lower level, but in general it is no more important than what kind of weapon Lee Harvey Oswald used to kill President Kennedy. It is not a question without interest, but it is not what makes the incident a watershed event in U.S. history. What we need to study in economics is not simply narrow policy choices within Western market economies. We need to know how these systems evolved, what values justify them, what cultural myths sustain them, and how people in them fare. Capitalism itself is not natural and cannot therefore be taken as a given. Further reading. Thorstein Veblen's Theory of the Leisure Class remains a classic work by the founder of institutionalism. In it, he made a scathing attack on the U.S. economy, essentially arguing that the ruling class engaged in conspicuous consumption, a coin he termed, on the backs of the industry of the lower classes. Clarence Ayres's The Theory of Economic Progress takes a later and more comprehensive view and is very easy to read. The main institutionalist journal, the Journal of Economic Issues, published 2 volumes designed as an introduction to their paradigm, and these were republished in book form. The prolific writings of John Kenneth Galbraith represent a Veblenian analysis of the U.S. economy in the mid to late 20th century and are intended for a general audience. Last, reference to the suggested reading in the chapter on post-Keynesianism might also be of use, given that a great many post-Keynesians also consider themselves institutionalists. That was chapter 7.